Right, Dr. P here again for lesson 3 of our Year 11 recapping. I hope all of you guys had a fantastic Easter, 2 weeks off. I certainly did. I got plenty of gardening done, cheeky bit of Minecraft on the go, but it's all good. We're going to get back to work now, so I thought we'll start off by looking at our specialised cells. So the first cell we'll look at is the classic sperm cell. Now, hopefully you've already got a pretty good idea of this one, and this one I've already filled in some of the key details for you on that worksheet, but I'm going to go through those details for you. So I'll just draw a fairly simplistic sperm cell. In reality, they would be a little bit more complicated than this. Nice little long tail there, like that. Okay, so that's the overall shape of them. So very, very unusual for a cell, eukaryotic cells. It's massively long tail. These are highly, highly modified specialised cells. Let's look at some of the interior details now. And what I'm drawing here now are some mitochondria. These aren't very accurate, but I'm going to have to draw them a bit smaller than I would like, but you get the idea. So that's your overall basic structure. So let's start looking at some of these features in turn. We'll start with dealing with some of the bits you maybe are going to be familiar with. Well, here's the nucleus of the sperm cell, typical of any eukaryotic cell having a nucleus, but what is unusual about the sperm cell is it has only half the number of chromosomes, i.e. one set of chromosomes. The proper term we call for that is haploid. So the reason it has a haploid nucleus is when it combines and fuses with the egg cell's nucleus during fertilization, we end up with restoring the diploid number, i.e. 2 sets of chromosomes. So half the genetic material in there present in the nucleus, which makes it unusual compared to other eukaryotic body cells. The mitochondria, we've already established we know quite a bit about those, but sperm cells have many of them, and it's very important that you kind of give that idea of a larger quantity than normal. Pretty much all cells have mitochondria for carrying out all the functional processes, so they can do respiration and release energy, but the sperm cells have many, many of them, and they're located near the base of the tail. Now the reason for having more of them means I can do more aerobic respiration, I can produce more ATP, and as a result I can release more energy to help that propel that tail to move. It's a hell of a journey a sperm cell's got to make. It's an absolutely tiny, tiny cell, and it's got a long way to go, so it needs a lot of energy to power that tail, and that's also the other feature there, is that long tail. Where do we start to diverge into kind of getting into more A-level territory? Well, we've got this structure at the front here called the acrosome. Now the acrosome contains loads of enzymes that are designed to help break through the outer layer of the egg cell, helping that head of the sperm cell to penetrate into the egg cell so it can fertilise it. The tail doesn't make all the way its way in, that'll actually drop off, but the head piece of the sperm will make its way in, and that will fuse, the nucleus in there will fuse with that the egg cell. So there's the sperm cell, quite a bit of detail there, so hopefully you've got your head around that. But our next cell we're going to look at is a plant cell. It's going to be a palisade mesophyll cell. So these are often found in plant cells. These are found in the leaves of plant cells, in vascular plants, and they do really look like your typical plant cell in many regards, a sort of stereotypical one. They're tall, they're kind of rectangular in shape, and they have all those key features that you'd expect. So cell wall, cell membrane, cytoplasm, nucleus. They would have ribosomes in there for producing proteins. They'll have some mitochondria in there to help them produce ATP and release energy. They're going to have all those other organelles we looked at as well. So you're going to see rough ER, smooth ER in there as well, Golgi. But what you're going to see the most of, and the most important part of palisade cells, is they're going to be absolutely ram-packed full of chloroplasts. Now I'm going to struggle to draw these accurately because of the scale, but I'm trying to draw here are those grana, those stacks of thylakoid membranes where all the chlorophyll is located for photosynthesis. So palisade cells, fairly typical in terms of their content. They've got the majority of the things you'd expect in any kind of plant-based cell, but they're going to have a large number of chloroplasts to absorb as much light as possible for photosynthesis. They are tall and fairly thin, so that way you can pack as many of them as possible to increase that surface area to absorb as much light as possible. I almost think of them as a little bit like a solar array on a solar panel. They're there to absorb as much light as possible in the leaf. So that's the palisade mesophyll cell, nice and simple, specialised cell. So the next cell we're going to be looking at is, of course, our root hair cell. So here we go, here's our root hair cell. Again, these are found in plant cells. One of the most common misconceptions I tend to find when I'm mentioning root hair cells is students think, what, the ones on your hair? No, not that kind of cell. You may have noticed I've had a cheeky haircut myself. Mrs. P cut it herself with her fair hands. I think she's done a pretty good job, but you guys might think what the hell's going on there, but I think it's all right. So root hair cells are not these. These are found on the roots of plants, and they're all about their main role, their main function is about absorbing water and mineral ions from the soil. So they've got to be specialised for that particular job. So the elephant in the room, I always think, with a root hair cell is this massively elongated extension here. They do have a cell wall, but it's much thinner than normal, although I'm struggling to draw that there on that extension. So they have a thinner cell wall. They have a very large vacuole. They have a nucleus. They'll have lots and lots of mitochondria, and I'll talk about them in a minute. Lots and lots of those. They'll have ribosomes, they'll have Golgi, they'll have the endoplasmic reticulum like we've talked about before. But the most conspicuous thing that's missing from these plant cells is chloroplasts. They don't have any chloroplasts at all. Now the main reason for that is, well, where are roots found typically? They're typically found underground in the soil. Don't get much light down there. There's no light, you can't do photosynthesis, so why bother going to all of that effort to construct structures that have no use? So these cells will simply not produce any chloroplasts. There are a few plants out there, epiphytes and things, that will have roots that are above ground that help anchor them onto plants, like orchids. You might notice some of your orchids growing in your homes. You might find actually their roots are green. So sometimes roots can be photosynthetic, but in general they can't. So they don't need to have any chloroplasts. So that's one of their first adaptations that make them kind of specialised. What else makes these guys different? Well, this extension here greatly increases that surface area for absorption of water and mineral ions. You can basically pack a hell of a lot more space, more surface area in a confined space. So this provides an entry point for those water molecules and those other mineral ions that are present in the soil. To help it uptake as many of those mineral ions as possible, because they tend to be in a very low concentration in the soil, we need to move them against their concentration gradient. Now, in order to do that, we've got to do the process of active transport. Active transport is that movement against the concentration gradient. It requires energy from respiration to do that, so that's why this guy has many mitochondria, which will mean it can do more aerobic respiration, produce more ATP, so it can do more active transport to uptake those mineral ions from the soil. So very important there. This large spacious vacuole as well, very important, because it's absorbing lots and lots of water. It needs to be able to absorb and hold on to that water, so it's basically an extra space for it to hold on to. One other last key detail to sort of mention here that is conspicuous for cells on the external parts of plants. So these will actually be literally on the outside. So if you imagine, here would be the rest of the root going in this direction here. Out here is the external environment, the outside world. This is the soil here. So this part of the cell is all exposed to the external environment. And normally in a plant cell, anything that's exposed to the environment would have a waxy cuticle layer around the outside. That prevent kind of a waterproofing, a bit like our skin, you know, a waterproofing protective layer. Root hair cells don't have that waxy cuticle for the main reason it would prevent any water from actually entering the root. So this is what's unique about root hair cells. They have no cuticle at all, and of course their cell wall is a lot thinner. That provides a much shorter diffusion and osmosis distance for those molecules to move into the root hair cell. So there's a nice detailed overlook of the root hair cell. We're now going to move on to looking at red blood cells. Cheeky tea break here. Beautiful, that. Beautiful. Right then, red blood cells. So here is our red blood cells. Now the proper name for red blood cells is erythrocytes, and these are by far and away the most abundant cell type in the human body. They vastly outnumber any other cell type. In fact, they make your blood look red. Your blood, the liquid, isn't actually red, it's plasma. The liquid part is actually kind of a yellowish colour. The reason it looks red is just the sheer number of those red blood cells in there. I liken it to the idea, if you had a little paddling pool and you put loads of yellow rubber ducks into it, if you were up close, you could see that there's yellow rubber ducks floating around in water. You'd be able to see the water. But if you zoomed out and maybe looked out from your bedroom window and looked down, you wouldn't see that water. You'd just see that sea of yellow rubber ducks. And that's kind of what's going on with red blood cells. There are just so many of them floating around there in the plasma, they look red. So what are they for? Well, their primary function is to transport oxygen to cells to enable them to carry out aerobic respiration. In terms of shape, they might look quite simplistic, but they've got a very well-engineered shape to help them carry out all their particular functions. So I guess they look from the top superficially like a donut. That isn't a hole that goes all the way through, by the way. That is like an indentation. If we were to look at that from the side, a side view, you would see that actually a red blood cell looks like that. So it's got these sort of two indents here, two indentations at the top and bottom. This overall shape, because it's got two indentations, we call it bi, concave because it goes in, and the overall its shape is a disc. So you could describe the red blood cell's shape as a biconcave disc. A biconcave disc, well, why does it have this shape? So basically it can increase its surface area to carry and transport as much oxygen as possible. What actually does the oxygen carrying is something that's inside that red blood cell. This red blood cell is packed with a protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is actually what gives the red blood cell its colour, because it comes from, heme comes from the word iron. It actually does, each hemoglobin molecule contains iron atoms, and they actually will bind, the oxygen will actually bind to that hemoglobin, and it can then transport it. And you get the chemical reaction. So hemoglobin plus oxygen reacts to form oxyhemoglobin. But the really cool thing about that reaction, it's a reversible one. So if I have hemoglobin plus oxygen, it will form oxyhemoglobin, and that also can go back again. So that's that symbol for a reversible reaction. Hopefully you can still read my writing there. So hemoglobin and oxygen, association going on, they form oxyhemoglobin, and then in areas where there's low levels of oxygen, low partial pressures is the proper term for it, in your muscle tissues, for example, the reaction reverses itself, and the hemoglobin lets go of that oxygen. The oxygen then can diffuse out of the red blood cell into the surrounding tissues. So it's absolutely packed full of that hemoglobin. Now, to aid it and to get even more hemoglobin in there, this is the only eukaryotic cell that I know of that has no nucleus. So the reason it has no nucleus is so there's more room to get hemoglobin in there. I like to think of it a bit like, oh, I've got to start up a new parcel delivery company. I've only got the car though. Well, I can't get that many parcels in the car because it's a car. But if I ripped out all the seats, I could get more boxes in. And that's what's going on here. We've removed a lot of the structures that are not necessary, like the nucleus, so I can get even more hemoglobin. More hemoglobin, more oxygen carrying. The shape, that circular disc shape, is also very important. It enables the red blood cells to squeeze through the little narrow gaps in the capillaries, so they can quite happily pass through there. So that's a nice detailed look at our red blood cells, the erythrocytes. Our next cell that we're going to be looking at is what we call squamous epithelium. Okay. So in terms of looking at these cells, they're fairly boring to look at, really. They're very flat, they're very thin, they look a bit like a kind of a pavement slab, really, and that's kind of their role. So surrounding all of our tissues, all of our cells, are all of our organs, I should say, sorry, around all of our organs, we have these squamous epithelial cells. They represent a kind of a lining layer, and they are very, very thin. You might find also the squamous epithelium making up the lining of the alveoli. So the alveoli are these little tiny air sacs found within our lungs, and they're there for gas exchange. And the squamous epithelium is well adapted for this role by being very, very thin. It provides a very, very short diffusion distance for any oxygen molecules or any carbon dioxide ones, so we can get very, very efficient gas exchange. So that's the squamous epithelium, like I say, pretty simple, thin, flat, providing that short diffusion distance, particularly in things like the alveoli and whatnot there. Great, so we'll have a look at these goblet cells now. Their shape's quite interesting, actually. I think they look a bit like a kind of a fat squid, I guess, something like that. Nucleus in there, of course, standard for any kind of eukaryotic cell. It's going to be full of mitochondria. Hopefully you've already got an idea now. We said that a few times. Large on mitochondria, you can start making some of those links. It will have lots and lots of ribosomes, much more probably than your average cell, along with those rough ERs as well. It's going to have Golgi in there as well, probably several of those actually, to be honest with you. And lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of vesicles at the top. Now, goblet cells, and you may have already come across these in Year 9 in infection and response lessons. Their job, their main role, is to produce and secrete mucus. So you have these lining any mucosal membranes, but the most obvious one I can think of would be your trachea, your windpipe. So along with ciliated epithelial cells, these cells are there to help defend you against airborne pathogens, as well as things like dust and pollen that might make their way into your airways. So the goblet cell's role in that job is to produce lots and lots of mucus. So what is mucus? Well, mucus is primarily protein based, actually. So in order to make those proteins, it's got those ribosomes, many of them. It can make more and more of those proteins that go in to help make the mucus, to help package and modify those proteins and put them into vesicles. That's what the Golgi are there for, and that's what those vesicles located in the top are going to be full of, that mucus. And again, lots and lots of mitochondria are providing all of that ATP, that energy release for all those processes. Like protein synthesis requires energy. Exocytosis, that's the bulk transport of these vesicles out of the cell, also requires energy. So these are quite energy intensive cells, so many mitochondria. They also have these little microvilli on the top here, not for absorption, which you'd expect to see in epithelial cells in the small intestine. I'm not actually sure why they have microvilli. Something maybe you can find out for me and leave in the comments. But there's our goblet cells. So yeah, that's our last specialised cell. Your research task is to find some other interesting specialised cells. Don't forget to look at my interesting fact as well in that PowerPoint slide I've sent you. That's got a really cool, I think, specialised cell in there. So Dr. P signing off. Stay safe, stay indoors, have a cheeky cup of tea.